Hello, and welcome to our post-election assessment U.S. Power Sector webinar. Our webinar today is presented by Norton Rose Fulbright in partnership with Infocast events. We have a great panel discussion coming up. Moderating our panel today is Keith Martin, partner at Norton Rose Fulbright. As for our panelists, we have with us John Gimigliano, principal in charge at KPMG Corporate Finance LLC and former Republican counsel to the House Ways and Means Committee. Tom Hassenboehler, partner at Coefficient Group and former Republican Chief Counsel for Energy and the Environment for the House Energy and Commerce Committee. Joseph Mikrut, partner at Capital Tax Partners and former Tax Legislative Counsel for the U.S. Department of the Treasury. Jonathan Weisgall, Washington Office Head at Berkshire Hathaway Energy, and Kathleen Weiss, Washington Office Head for First Solar Inc. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know that this webinar is a preview of what you can experience at Infocast's upcoming Federal Energy Policy Summit. As an attendee of this webinar, you are entitled to a special discounted price of $4.95 to attend the summit. You may register online at infocastinc.com/FEP Summit. Thank you for your time, and now I'd like to welcome Keith Martin.
So thank you very much, Laura, and I'd like to thank our panelists. Joe Mikrut's probably used to several pronunciations of his last name. We're going to discuss today what the midterm election results mean for the U.S. power sector, particularly renewable energy. Just to lay the background, the Republicans held on to the Senate but lost the House. A number of races remain too close to call at this point. In the Senate, where there are 100 senators, the split after the election is 51 Republicans to 46 Democrats, but there are 3 seats that remain too close to call. If the Democrats win all 3, then we will end up with the same 51-49 split in the Senate as before the election. The undecided seats are in Arizona, where Kyrsten Sinema, the Democrat, is leading by 0.5% of the vote. Florida, where Rick Scott, the Republican, is leading by 0.2%, and Mississippi, where a runoff will be required, but the Republican has a slight lead, Cindy Hyde-Smith, with 41.5% of the vote, and Mike Espy, former Agriculture Secretary under Bill Clinton, the Democrat, with 40.6% of the vote. On the House side, there are 435 seats. The split after the election is 225 Democrats to 197 Republicans, with 13 races still too close to call. A majority is 218, so the Democrats are assured of control. Our panelists this afternoon are a veteran group of Washington insiders. You have 2 Republicans, 1 Democrat who've come off Capitol Hill and have been off there for some time, with the exception of Tom Hassenboehler, who was chief counsel for Energy and Environment to the House Energy and Commerce Committee until October of last year. We also have 2 Washington office heads, one for a holding company that owns both regulated and unregulated businesses, and one for a prominent solar company. The call will last an hour. A recording will be available on the Norton Rose Fulbright website later in the day. If you have questions as we go along, there is a space on your computer screen where you can type them in and press send. We'll get to as many as we can. So, panel, without getting into all of the details, how do you see the election results, positive, negative, or neutral for the power sector, and particularly for renewable energy? Let's start with John Weisgall and then work around.
Well, with those 3 choices, Keith, I would call it neutral. Some were expecting a Democratic tsunami in the House. I think it was barely a wave. So despite the House flipping, I don't see much change down the road. I think the polarization and paralysis will probably continue in Washington. I do see a mixed bag in some state ballot initiatives, and I see some positive gains in state houses and governor's races. So on balance, I'll give it a neutral.
Okay. Kathy Weiss, Washington office head for First Solar. How do you see things?
I think I'd give it on balance, a positive review. Despite making some really significant progress in growing bipartisan support for renewable energy in both chambers, the fact is the GOP-controlled House had some pretty powerful opponents that just really didn't support policies to help our sector grow. The Senate was always a little bit more balanced, and I think we had some champions in the Senate that helped us move forward with some important policies over the last couple of years. So I would say if we're looking at the Democratic control of the House now, not only is there an opportunity to support positive legislation, but also gives us a backstop from folks that even as last year tried to talk about turning back the clock on some of the progress that we've made.
Okay, let's go next to Tom Hassenboehler, who was on the Republican side in the House until last October. How do you see things?
Thanks, Keith. I view it slightly positive, in particular in the Congress. There's an opportunity with the Democrats taking control for Republicans who may have been a little gun-shy about supporting renewable power, or who may have been a little bit more inclined to support the party line under a completely Republican House, Senate, and White House, to get a little more unconventional and bold in their thinking. Certainly, I can see a lot of opportunities for some new alliances to form that have been privy to previous examples of divided government, aka the 2007 Energy Independence and Security Bill, where you had a larger bill come forth in a split White House and Congress. So I don't foresee something that big happening in the next 2 years, but certainly from a viewpoint of just how the election results would trend towards renewable energy in particular, I'd view them more positive than neutral.
Okay, let's go next to Joe Mikrut, who has more of a Democratic perspective. He had been tax legislative counsel in the Treasury, and before that on the Joint Tax Committee staff.
Okay, thanks. I think I'd agree that it was a slight net positive. I think the Democrats, looking at it from a tax perspective, I think the presumptive chairman Neal probably is more of a supporter of renewables than current chairman Brady, particularly when you look at the tax reform bill that the chairman produced last year. And I think when you go to the Senate, the likely chairman Grassley has always been a supporter of renewables, so I think that's positive. But I may agree with Jonathan that even though it's trending positive, it's difficult to see how the parties can get together with the White House to produce anything.
Okay, and then batting cleanup, John Gimigliano with KPMG.
Yeah, I see it as a positive. I largely echo what others have said. I think that obviously Democratic control in the House is helpful, that there was a lot of antipathy, I think, on the Republican side towards renewables over the years. And if it is indeed Speaker Pelosi who's back, I think Speaker Pelosi has proven to be a pretty reliable supporter of renewables. And I think one of the trends that we've seen over the years that more and more policy is done out of committee and in leadership. And so I think that Speaker Pelosi showed in her last stint as Speaker that she was a reliable supporter. And then again, to what Joe said on the Senate side, we are going to have, I believe, Chairman of the Senate Finance Committee Grassley, who has often called himself the grandfather or the godfather of the wind tax credit. And it's really more than wind, in that if you think about when he was last chairman, including during the Energy Policy Act of 2005, virtually all of the provisions that are currently in the PTC and in the ITC came in, or the majority of them anyway, while Grassley was chairman. So I think you could look to him to be a supporter to the extent he can as well.
John, just sticking with you, was that a different era, though? It seemed like after Obama was elected, you had an entering class of Republicans who felt support for renewables must have started with Obama, therefore they were opposed to it. Have times changed?
Yeah, it's as somebody who worked on Republican staff, and when I was the Ways and Means Committee, we put in a lot, the solar investment tax credit and other things, working with Democrats and doing that, and largely had Republican support. Yes, something did change. Never been entirely clear on what did change. All the more reason why I think change of control in the House, where the majority has absolute control, a majority of one is an absolute majority in the House. The Democrats will be more or less able to do what they want to do in the House. And in the Senate side, it's been always less of an issue in terms of opposition to renewables for Republicans in the Senate. So that's why I come back to, look, this, to me, the outcome that we got was about as good as could have been expected, including with Grassley moving over apparently to be the next chairman of the Senate Finance Committee.
Okay. Let me posit this and see if you folks agree, and we'll start back with John Weisskopf. But it seems like if there's an expanded Republican caucus in the Senate will move to the right because Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, two moderate Republican senators, will have less influence. And then whether we get 2 years of gridlock or there is room to work together depends on whether the House Democrats vote as a bloc or there's a large enough blue dog caucus of more conservative Democrats that emerges that can combine with Republicans to put through part of the remaining Trump program. So, John Weisskopf, do you agree with that analysis?
Well, in general, I would say moderates were hurt in this election, but I do think you're right that Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski will have less influence. The blue dogs, the conservative Democrats, currently, I think at about 18, are hoping to double, and they could have an eye towards voting on bloc on some of the more business-friendly issues. They certainly were very successful at this in the late 1990s. They want to get back to their heyday. I see them more as a bloc on non-energy issues. I think that on most energy issues that we might be talking about, whether it's electric vehicles, grid modernization, we'll get to those. I suspect they would go along with other members of the House, but I do see them as a potentially conservative bloc to combine with a number of Republicans, possibly. Yes, I do, and I see them certainly their numbers expanding in the House.
Okay, Kathy, any view on that? Kathy Weiss?
Well, I agree with Jonathan. I just sort of say, well, it depends on what the issue is. So we're not refighting those more divisive fights of the last couple of years with tax credit fights. So, and I don't think anybody's going to move on to an aggressive climate policy, in the next 2 years. So if we're talking about middle of the ground issues where there's naturally more bipartisan support, like an infrastructure bill, then I don't think those shifts really work against us in any way.
Okay. Let me just ask the other three, any contrary view to what has already been said?
This is Tom Hassenboehler. I mean, I don't have a contrary view, but I have a slight contrary view just on the fact that I do think the blue dog, I mean, in particular on the energy and climate issues, are going to be less relevant, in how to function things. And I think a lot of this is going to be driven back to committee chairs and the House leadership. And so, I don't think it makes a big difference in the Senate that Lisa Murkowski is going to have less influence. I think that a lot of that is much more, broader impact of sort of, how the Senate's going to be viewed by the House, and the House is going to have to make some decisions about what issues they want to work with the Senate on and which ones they just want to be in pure, partisan posturing. And my guess is energy and infrastructure, which I know we'll get into, may have a little bit of play in that as we go forward.
Okay. Well, let's move to infrastructure. Does anyone foresee action on infrastructure?
Jonathan here. I can see infrastructure as a vehicle for incremental progress on climate change, investments in electric vehicle technology, for example, other renewable energy issues. I think it can get bipartisan support. How you get there, I don't know. It reminds me of the expression, everybody wants to go to heaven, no one wants to die. I mean, in polling, everybody's for infrastructure, but no agreement on how to get there. Democrats want direct spend. They want to maintain environmental rules and not ease permitting, and Republicans pretty much exactly the opposite. I do think, and you've got the opposition from fiscal conservatives. I can certainly see a continued course of permitting reform in that area, by the way. But yes, I do think that infrastructure is one area where there can be reaching across the aisle, and I can see infrastructure being expanded from the usual roads, bridges, tunnels, to include some renewable energy issues as well, which could bring Democrats on board.
The renewable energy issues, John, are they more than electric vehicles? Transmission, for example, all Trump proposed early in the year was basically to sell off federal transmission assets.
That ain't going to happen, but certainly on other grid modernization, and I think you can throw in some cybersecurity, hardening of the grid, and things like that. I can certainly see that as part of an infrastructure bill. Although, again, you're going to, the devil's going to be in the details. I can't remember the last time anyone decided that government should pay a utility to improve transmission. I mean, that's normally a private sector job, so it's going to be tough to see where that comes in.
It's a little worse, I think, than you described, John, isn't it, that there's no agreement on how to pay for anything? Not only are they split on general approach, but no money.
Oh, absolutely. No, I think that's right. I mean, you've got, if Democrats want to spend, see it as a direct spend, I think that what you had with what the president proposed actually right after the election was this private-public partnership, tolls, tax incentives, things like that. And it's very hard to see where that will come. And with the Democrats, they're talking about increasing, to pay for it, raising the corporate tax rate from the 21%, eliminating some tax benefits in the 2007 tax package, and that's going to be a very hard one to get across the goal line as well.
Okay. Yeah, I see this as the biggest challenge with doing something on infrastructure, which clearly is broadly very popular. You could do a lot of good things that would benefit various sectors of the economy, but it's really the challenge is one of leadership and the ability to compromise. And certainly coming out of these last 2 years, it's a pretty poor roadmap to see who's going to emerge to provide the leadership to push something like this through in a way that would require compromise on both sides. So that's my biggest concern. I think that it could be done, but it's not clear who would be the driving force to force that compromise. I think it's interesting on the notion about how much it would cost, because again, it depends upon the approach they take. While I don't think there's any appetite to add more to the deficit, the fact is that there's probably something like $40 billion, in the economy, whether it's U.S. money or foreign overseas money, that wants to invest in technologies, that wants to invest in new infrastructure, that wants to invest in modernizing the grid. So it really needs to be put together in a way that does bring that private money into the sector.
Okay.
No easy task.
Let's start with the lame duck session and then work beyond this year. So Congress will return in late November for a short lame duck session. It has to pass new spending authority to allow a number of government agencies to remain open past December 7. A tax extenders bill is on the agenda. Joe Mikrut and John Gimigliano, do you see the tax extenders bill passing, and do you expect anything in it to affect the power or infrastructure sector? Maybe starting with Joe.
Okay, thanks. I think there's a very good chance that the tax extenders package, or I guess the expired provisions package, will go forward in the lame duck. There's about 30-some provisions that expired as of the beginning of the year, many of them energy-related, the so-called energy provisions, 45 and 48. I think there's a very good chance that happens. I think there's a bipartisan support, but I think most of it's coming, I think, from the Democrats. And in a negotiation, there are certain things that the Republicans want to see get done, including potentially some of the technical corrections to the tax reform bill. I don't see that being done broadly, but there's a couple of provisions that have become more important than others. That maybe that's the workings of the deal. And there's a couple other bipartisan pieces of tax legislation that also can get done, dealing with retirement savings and IRS administrative reforms.
But drilling down on production tax credits or investment tax credits, anything involving them?
Well, I think the provisions, the parts of sections 45 and 48 that have expired could be extended. Now, whether they're only going to do it for 1 year or what traditionally Congress has done in a lame duck session is go back one and go forward one and kind of clear the decks for next year. I think it's a possibility.
And that's you're speaking just about biomass and geothermal, basically, correct?
Right. Yep. Those are the primary ones.
All right, John Gimigliano. So more time for biomass and geothermal projects to qualify for tax credits. John Gimigliano.
Yeah, maybe. Look, I agree with you, Joe. I agree with everything you said, and it's probably, if I had to bet a dollar, that's the way I'd bet. I do sometimes come around to the way Congress has evolved in recent years on doing extenders, doing them retroactively, sort of the worst possible tax policy to provide people benefits for things they've already done. And you almost wonder if somebody might wonder or not if they might not get a better deal and the ability to get a longer-term prospective extension if they could just wait till January. You always hate to leave behind a chance to get them extended when you can, but it seems like the biggest impediment to getting extenders done all these years has always been House Republicans. And in January, if you have House Democrats dealing with Senate Republicans and Democrats who've always sort of been obviously much more supportive, you might not get a better deal. So, while I agree with you, Joe, I wouldn't also be shocked for somebody to come up with the idea that maybe we should just wait till January.
That's like Charlie Brown being shown the football by Lucy. I'm not sure I'd do that.
Yeah, John, I agree with you. But the only thing is, I think the House Republicans understand as well. So, to the extent they want to get something out of what may be otherwise inevitable, they may play along.
Right. That's what it comes back to: is what can Brady really get for doing these now, and maybe, as you point out, it's technicals or something else. That's right.
So it seems like there are two areas where the parties might truly find common ground, and one is prescription drug prices, and other is trade. Ironically, Trump will pick up support for import tariffs among the Democrats. So is a rollback of import tariffs now out of the question? Let's go back to John Weisskell.
Not my area of expertise, but my general view here is that there's a lot more going on with U.S.-China relations than tariffs. Or to put it another way, I think tariffs are being used for a whole lot of other issues, specifically national security, military. I mean, Trump himself has virtually talked about economic security as national security. I think this is one area where, the parties, he has simply flipped the Republicans on this issue, and traditionally there has been Democratic support for these tariffs. But I just think it's a much more complicated issue, and I think there are going to be a lot of stops and starts because I think he is using tariffs in general to put his foot on and off the gas pedal for other issues.
Okay. Some power
I agree.
companies.
This is Kathy.
Go ahead.
I agree with that. I think it's really a strategy to reset trade practices that, quite frankly, if you look at when the WTO was first put in place, some of the countries that are large, thriving economies really were fledgling startup economies, and a lot's changed. And so I think it's appropriate to go back and relook at the rules of engagement. The administration has not wavered on this, so I think they're pretty dug in. And we'll see if the tariffs then do lead to, I think, like Jonathan indicated, what the ultimate goal is to renegotiate and reset the table in terms of how we trade with the rest of the world, most specifically China. I would agree. That said, the caveat there and the unknown there is, at what point is there so much economic disruption, that forces a desire to claim victory, at whatever cost.
And who can hold back the most? I mean, our economy can be hurt, but the Chinese are not a democratic country. So I have a sense that the Chinese will try to hold out longer.
Yeah.
So the tariffs that Trump imposed in September on $200 billion in Chinese imports at 10% bump automatically to 25% on January 1. So there is some peril also being created by 25% steel tariffs. Those are hurting the wind tower manufacturers. There are 200 tons of steel in a wind tower, and also some solar companies that may not have anticipated them in bidding to supply power at particular prices. Some of these companies are hoping that the revamped NAFTA agreement would provide some relief from the 25% steel tariff by allowing steel to come in through Mexico. Maybe the tax guys are closer to this. When do you see this revamped NAFTA treaty moving through the Senate? Anybody?
This is John. I'll just say, again, not my area of expertise, but just in some conversations I've had, it doesn't seem like a sure thing. So I mean, I think this is one of the things that we're going to have to see when they come back, whether or not this is on the agenda and whether or not it's absolutely a sure thing. And if it's not, then what do we go back to?
Okay.
Yeah,
there have been. Go ahead.
I was just going to agree with John. I mean, I was talking to some of the Hill folks recently, and they're first now going through there and finding things that they were basically unaware of in the bill that they think may be problematic to try to move the current package.
Okay, that was Joe Mikrut. By the way, if you have questions, just there's a place on your computer screen to type them in. Our panelists are John Gimigliano with KPMG, former Republican counsel to the House Ways and Means Committee. Tom Hassenboehler, who's a partner with the Coefficient Group and a former chief counsel for energy and the environment to the House Energy and Commerce Committee. Joe Mikrut, former Joint Tax Committee staffer and former tax legislative counsel at the U.S. Treasury, currently a partner at Capital Tax Partners. John Weisskell, who's the Washington office head for Berkshire Hathaway Energy, and Kathy Weiss, who's the Washington office head for First Solar. There have been conflicting stories since the election about whether House Democrats will press for action on climate change. Some people say Nancy Pelosi will insist the House lie low on this issue because it's a fruitless exercise. What do you think? Is action on climate change possible in the next 2 years? I know, John Weisskell, you said already some little bit of that might sneak into an infrastructure bill through action on electric vehicles. Anything more broad than that, would anything more broad than that be likely to occur?
That crosses the finish line, no. I mean, I think Pelosi wants to revive the now defunct, I think it was called, the House Select Committee on Energy Independence and Global Warming that was scrapped in 2011. But she still has war wounds from Waxman-Markey back in 2010 when a number of Democrats were defeated after that passed the House. Having said that, Paul Tonko of New York, who will chair the new Energy Subcommittee of House Energy and Commerce, I think will work on a cap and trade bill. I think we'll look at there'll be a push for a carbon tax. There'll be a push to try to look at the Paris deal. I think that's kind of out of the question. Nothing's going to happen there. I mean, foreign policy is totally up to the president. So, yeah, I see little actions, but I don't see anything that targeted on climate change happening. And Pelosi, I don't think is going to want to bring that up because she's clever enough to not bring a bill that's not going to go anywhere, but she may feel that pressure from now a more left-leaning House.
Okay. Tom Hassenboehler, you were in charge of this issue in the House on the Republican side.
Yeah, I've got a few thoughts on that too, and I tend to agree, although I think it could be even more of a muted response. And I used yesterday's press release from Frank Pallone, who'll be the incoming chairman, as an example of what exactly is on their agenda. They had about 8 issues: healthcare, undoing Trump's administration's effort to sabotage our healthcare system, lowering health costs, strengthening Medicare, rebuilding America by investing in green energy, drinking water. Climate change doesn't even get on the agenda from the E&C committee to number 5, and it's addressing climate change by looking at the impacts on communities and holding the administration accountable for its policies that can make it worse. So in my view, really, I do think there's going to be some individual efforts from members. For instance, it was mentioned that Tonko, maybe working on some ideas for a cap and trade type bill or some other things. But I think a lot of this is largely going to happen sort of at a member-to-member direct level. There's going to be some conversations about, how to bring about what the next wave of climate solutions are. There's going to be, but the primary, I think, organized effort by the Democratic majority is going to be when it comes to climate change at all, which is, again, like I think issue number 5 or 6 on the list, it's going to be about holding the Trump administration accountable, doing a lot of oversight, and then potentially incrementally addressing the issue through potentially some of the infrastructure ideas that we talked about. There's a lot there on grid mod, on electric vehicles, those types of things, in addition to, looking more at the clean air protections and trying to find ways to secure future administration action can be taken through the Clean Air Act in reverse of what the current White House is contemplating through the Clean Power Plan.
Okay. Let me ask a few questions of the tax guys. Others speak up if you have a view on this. But Trump called in the last 2 weeks before the election for another tax cut bill, and he said at his press conference this week that he'd be open to increasing the corporate tax rate to pay for a middle income tax cut. For those in our audience who are doing tax equity deals, how much risk is there of a change in the corporate tax rate in the next 2 years, and in which direction? Starting with John Gimigliano.
Well, the directional one is easy. It's not, I just can't imagine it going down. And so if it moves, it's going up. And I think there is a real risk that it could go up. We've already seen, as somebody mentioned earlier, that the Senate Democrats have put out a proposal to pay for infrastructure by raising the rate to 25. President Obama's framework on tax reform was 28%. I think those are all plausible scenarios that we could see Democrats propose. And I'm still trying to pick my jaw up off the floor when I heard the president say that he'd be willing to consider that scenario to pay for a middle-class tax cut. I'm sure it wasn't a happy day for Mitch McConnell when he heard that statement. So I think that there is a meaningful risk that the rate could go up. I'm not saying it's likely, but it's certainly something you can't rule out in the coming years.
Joe Mikrut, not likely, but possible. Do you agree?
I do agree, and I agree with John. It was very surprising that you had a president who was advocating originally for a 15% rate, saying that he doesn't mind raising the current rate to something higher. Incoming Chairman Neal has said that he's willing to do a middle class tax cut, but he wouldn't look necessarily at the corporate rate. He would look at the top individual rate, which suggests that the Democrats may be reserving the corporate rate for something else. But circling back again, I guess to the how would you pay for infrastructure? Maybe the corporate tax rate is something that, since the president seems already to be bought in on it, and since he also wants to do an infrastructure bill, maybe part of the funding source there.
Kevin Brady.
I was going to say, it doesn't get you that much money is the problem, right? They go 21 to 25. You don't raise as much money raising the rate as it costs in lowering it for technical reasons. But the reality is that doesn't get you very far if in the end you really are trying to do a large middle class tax cut, which could cost $1 trillion or more. So there has to be more money elsewhere, I think.
So here's maybe one idea. Kevin Brady, the outgoing chairman of the House Tax Committee, suggested before the election the House might address misuse of tax credits as one way to pay for the Trump middle-class tax cuts. Do you think he was referring to anything specific?
Oh, I believe those mostly dealt with the individual refundable credits, Keith.
Okay.
Right, the EITC.
Yeah. Okay. Yep. That was Joe Mikrut and John Gimigliano. SEIA, which is the Solar Energy Industries Association, wants to make the investment tax credit refundable. The Edison Electric Institute, which is a trade group for the utilities, wants to bring back the equivalent of Build America bonds to fund utility and other infrastructure improvements. There's a bipartisan group that's promoting tax credits for energy storage. Another group wants a longer period for offshore wind projects to be built to qualify for tax credits. Do you guys see any of these proposals moving in 2019, maybe starting again with John Gimigliano?
Well, boy, the refundable investment tax credit, I mean, that was difficult. That's something that was contemplated back in, 2009? So we ended up with the cash grant program when that was deemed to be sort of a bridge too far. Look, I guess you could see Build America bonds as finding a way into, or something like that, into an infrastructure bill. but I think it has to be wrapped into something bigger. These are not the kind of things that will likely move along on their own, and it could be the kind of thing where Republicans have always been reluctant to raise taxes to pay for pure spending, whereas they have been, amenable, as we saw in the last bill, the big tax reform bill, to raise taxes to pay for other tax cuts. So to the extent that you can take that revenue from tax increases and use it on tax items that are tax cuts, like something you could put into Build America bonds, then I think it's, at least in the Senate, where you're going to have to get Republican votes, you seem like you have a better chance.
Okay. Joe?
Yeah, I think when you kind of tick through the items you mentioned, Keith, I think refundability is very, very difficult. But you could see something that's more in the nature of transferability. If you look at the nuclear credit, how it was amended recently to make those credits a little bit transferable, that might be a blueprint for that. There's a lot of support for storage on a bipartisan basis, so you could see that moving. Jonathan mentioned changes perhaps to the electric vehicle credit. There's a lot of activity there. Unfortunately, it's on both sides. Some would repeal it immediately. Some would extend it. But all these things, though, you need something to attach it to a vehicle. So whether it's perhaps an infrastructure bill could carry some of these things because energy provisions can be supported as infrastructure. Traditionally, these are the sorts of things that would be in a tax title to an energy bill, but it's hard to see anything of significance there, I think, at least in the short term. So, the problem the issue with tax provisions is they're sort of like a fine wine. They've got to sit mellow for a few years before they finally get picked up and included in something. But I think there's a lot of interest in doing a lot of the provisions that you ticked off.
Keith, Jonathan here. Not my area of expertise. I'll throw out one idea, though. An offshore wind PTC. I mention it because there hasn't been any offshore wind until very recently, the first just, I guess, last year or the year before in Rhode Island. So you could view it as a newer technology, so you avoid the wind, the traditional onshore wind or solar issues. And secondly, offshore wind is the one area of renewable energy that is getting remarkably strong support from the Trump administration. So I just throw that out as a possibility. I haven't talked about it with anybody, but it's worth flagging.
Okay, let's go back to our non-tax people. FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, is effectively down to 3 commissioners, 2 Democrats and 1 Republican. President Trump nominated a pro-coal Department of Energy official, Bernard McNamee, to fill a slot. His confirmation requires, I think, 60 votes in the Senate, which may be hard to get. Do you guys see him getting through, and if so, when? And what difference does it make whether FERC has another commissioner? John, maybe you want to start there.
Well, I do see him getting through. I think he will get through by the end of this year, and I think it will matter because there are a number of issues where right now you've got 3 commissioners effectively. Whether McIntyre may vote on some issues where he's heard, but I don't think he's going to be voting on anything new. So bringing on another commissioner will be important. We could have a flip. You've got an example where Commissioners LaFleur and Glick have big issues on permitting for new natural gas pipelines. Bringing on another Republican, will make a difference, but we may not see anything. We may see McNamee come on this board and then this year, and then possibly when LaFleur goes off, and if McIntyre retires, we may see next year a pairing of a Democrat and a Republican to come back on that would get it back up to the full 5 and 3-2 Republican.
Okay. Yeah. Kathy Weiss, does it make a difference whether FERC is up to full force?
I support everything that Jonathan said. And boy, wouldn't it be nice if things happened a bit more the way traditionally they have in the past? That would be a good thing to see.
Okay. Both PJM and FERC have suggested that renewable generators should be required to bid at least a minimum offer price to supply capacity to PJM. Right now, they can bid 0 and be certain to be selected, and then get a capacity payment, which is the market clearing price that others receive. but FERC has seemed unable to reach a consensus. The 2019 auction is expected at this point to be delayed by 3 months. Is this a big deal for any generators, any renewable generators?
This is Kathy. Yeah, I mean, I think it is a big deal for renewables. The existing renewables likely won't be subject to the minimum offer rule. So there does seem to be a fundamental misunderstanding at PJM on the cost of renewables. One example is looking at their first attempt at creating a minimum offer price for solar was based on taking 2011 capacity costs and then escalating them to 2023, which is essentially the opposite of what's happening in the real world, where costs have declined significantly year over year. So it's definitely an important one to stay on top of.
Okay. In the same vein, the Perry plan to require RTOs and ISOs to dispatch coal and nuclear plants ahead of other generators and pay them enough to keep them profitable appears to have stalled at the White House due to the potential effect on electricity prices. Do you guys think it is dead, or we're going to see some other version of it? Tom Hassenboehler, maybe you have a view on this.
Yeah, thanks, Keith. No, I don't think it's dead, even though it's certainly deflated. There's a lot of potential things that DOE is working on in the works that will have some potential implications for this, whether it's a new NERC assessment on capacity margins and lack of excess capacity going out into the next 3 to 5 year cycle, or whether it's a new study on national security implications and grid security, confidential business information, trying to figure out how to put all that together into a package to to protect and inventory those kind of critical assets. I think there's going to be a number of different attempts still done by the administration over the next year to kind of change the debate on this a little bit. It won't necessarily look like it did when the NOPR came out about a year ago. But in addition to that, RTOs and ISOs are starting to receive a lot more attention from Congress, as well as a lot of these issues have become more mainstream. So I would flag that as a potential oversight issue for the Energy and Commerce Committee in particular. The House Democrats will be looking to take on these issues. I would see them taking on everything from how the administration is handling the critical infrastructure designations and the ideas behind the need or the lack thereof for these kind of capacity market interventions, all the way to what's going on with RTOs from a governance perspective, looking at new technologies, looking at their boards and their oversight. There's been a lot of interest on those issues kind of percolating over time, and this gives them a great opportunity to bring those up into the mainstream a bit.
Okay. The Perry plan, the FERC minimum offer price proceeding, lawsuits in Illinois and New York to block zero emissions credits that keep nuclear power plants operating are all manifestations of the battle among different types of generators for market share in what is otherwise a stagnant market for electricity demand. Where else do you see this battle playing out, if at all?
This is Tom Hassenboehler again. I've got a thought too on access to data is really where a lot of this is going to start to go. In my view, there's emerging interest on where and how data can be aggregated into attributional profiles in the market, and there's talks about this at the state level and at the RTO level about utilizing whether it's industrial data, smart meter data, or upstream data to differentiate products. There's going to be all this is getting into the food fight among generation classes about how to market and how to value their energy in a very evolving system. And so I think there's going to be a lot of talk that's just now starting to emerge about how data access and that particular lens will make a difference in this fight as we go forward.
Keith, I would add, Jonathan, here on your question, kind of about it goes beyond market. Well, it is market share. It boils down to that. But I think we're also seeing kind of I don't want to call it a fig leaf of resilience or reliability, but certainly those are two words now being used to argue for subsidies. And there's no question that, I mean, when I look at the West, you look at the lowered cost of renewables, you look at the positive impact on greenhouse gas emissions. Why wouldn't this be a slam dunk? Answer: reliability. Answer: resilience. So I think that's part of the picture.
Okay.
Yeah, this is Kathy. Another potential new battlefront. It's our understanding NERC is working on an accelerated retirement report, and possibly that report will be out later this year. So those results and how the study was performed, I think will be of interest in tracking this issue as well.
Okay. There were three, let's move to the state level quickly. There were three big state ballot initiatives with potential effects on the power industry. All three lost. One is a carbon tax in Washington State. It went down for the second time. Another is a target of 50% renewables by 2030 in Arizona. That failed. And a third was a move to end the monopoly that utilities have on retail electricity supply in Nevada. That failed. There was a slight increase in the renewables target in Nevada. John Weiskell, you were in the thick of a lot of this. What should one make of this pattern?
Well, it's not a pattern. That's the problem. I mean, look at the contrast between those two purple states, where moving to go to a 50% renewable standard passes in Nevada, 50% by 2030, and the identical version, 50% by 2030, fails in Arizona. Actually, both backed by billionaire Tom Steyer. Now, in Nevada, it is a constitutional amendment. It will have to go through another round. I mean, one lesson here in all of these is the most money spent on the ballot initiatives wins. So that's one way to interpret them, especially when you throw in one more measure, the anti-fracking measure in Colorado. So it's really very much a mixed bag. I mean, Washington tried a new version on the carbon fee, not carbon tax, but that still didn't work. But it's hard to interpret some of this. In Colorado, the anti-fracking ban, while it lost 57 to 43, the proponents were outspent something like 40 to 1. It's like $38 million to under $1 million. So, complicated issues. Certainly the question in Nevada that was very close to my company, one of our utilities, a very complicated issue, hard to put into sound bites, but a matter that would have dismantled and deregulated Nevada's existing electricity system. And I think voters were I think affected by a report from the Public Utility Commission itself in Nevada talking about increase in rates and just the fact that it would really put into paralysis any progress on renewable energy. So I think voters in general were concerned about the impact on pocketbooks. But interestingly enough, in Nevada, where voters and the public have seen very low prices for renewables, that was not an issue, and it certainly will hardly be a problem getting to 50% renewables in Nevada. So, going back to my initial comments when we started the call, very much a mixed bag on these various state initiatives. And you haven't even talked about the gas taxes, but certainly for those four issues, a very mixed bag.
And we have to mention the gubernatorial races. There were Democrats elected in Illinois, Michigan, and Colorado, all of whom support 100% renewables. Maine, Kansas elected Democratic governors who may trend more toward renewables than the past. So that does seem to be a positive. On balance, at the state level, despite the fact these three ballot initiatives went down, was the result mainly a positive?
Again, jumping in here, Jonathan, I think it was. I mean, you've got Maine, New Mexico will make some changes in renewables. You had, I think now it's 23 Democratic governors, 26 Republicans, Georgia not resolved, and a number of them. I mean, you mentioned some, but Illinois, Kansas, Michigan, Maine, Nevada, New Mexico, Wisconsin, all flipping to Democrats, and many with Democrats who want to act on renewable energy, attorneys general winning and a couple of new trifectas. I don't have it where both branches of the legislature and the governor's house going to the Democrats. So I think that is the one positive, at least in terms of a trend line for renewables.
Okay. Let me, we're having a little technical difficulty with audience questions. I think some of them are coming in, but they're hard to see on the screen. I'm going to ask Laura from Infocast to sift through a few and ask them, but let me ask a big question before we get there. And that is Trump now in a stronger position to be reelected in 2020? The way I look at it, the Electoral College, which determines who's elected president, works more like the Senate than the House, and Trump did well in the Senate races. So, John Gimigliano, what do you think?
It's a good question. When you say is he in a better position, I think the first question is relative to what? Relative to 2016 when he first won, or relative to 2018, these midterms. And by I think almost any measure, he's going to be better position than he was in 2018, just because history tells us first-term, midterm environments are always terrible for the president and the president's party. So, if history stands, then the playing field should be better. The question is it going to be better than it was in 2016? And we expected him to do reasonably well in the Senate. But as you said at the outset, Keith, a number of these races are still not resolved. And if in the end, with the very favorable map that Republicans have, if they end up in the status quo, 51-49, I'm not sure you can point to that as really a successful outcome for the president. So let's see how those races sort of settle out, and then we'll see where we get to in 2020.
Kathy,
and
Weiss,
let's start.
I completely agree. Nothing to add to that.
Okay, and John, I interrupted you. What were you going to add?
Well, I was going to add to what John said in terms of the Senate. I mean, this year, 25 Democrats, 9 Republicans, and as we know, I forget the numbers, but 10 of the Democrats running in states Trump won. 2020 is kind of a flip. You got 22 Republicans up and 12 Democrats. But again, maybe not much of a change. I think 20 of the 22 Republicans are in Trump-carried states. I think the exceptions being Maine and Colorado that Clinton had carried in 2016. And I think similar for the Democrats, like, 10 of the 12 maybe, of the Democrats are in Clinton-carried states, with only 2 in Trump states, Michigan and Alabama. It's kind of interesting, actually. 2016 was the first time in the history of popularly elected senators that the Senate outcomes actually completely matched the presidential outcomes. So if history is going to be a judge, we may see that static continue in the Senate in 2020, but it's going to be a very, very different cast of. It's going to be a very different makeup in terms of that 22 Republicans versus 12 Democrats versus what we saw this year, where it was an uphill. The math was terrible for the Democrats in these Senate races from the get-go.
Okay. We have 5 panelists. We're going to ask Laura from Infocast to just sift through the audience questions, see if there are any that should be asked at this point. The 5 panelists: John Gimigliano from KPMG, former Republican counsel to the House Ways and Means Committee; Tom Hassenboehler, partner Coefficient Group, former chief counsel, Energy and the Environment for the Republican side on the House; Joe Mikrut, partner Capital Tax Partners, former Joint Tax Committee staffer and a tax legislative counsel at the U.S. Treasury during a Democratic administration; John Weisskell, Washington office head, Berkshire Hathaway Energy; and Kathleen Weiss, Washington office head, First Solar. Laura, is there anything that we can fit in here briefly? If not, I'll have one more question.
Sure. So I'll work my way back in the order that the questions have been received. The first question comes from Ms. Virginia L. There's a large difference between Nevada and Arizona propositions, success or lack thereof in Arizona. Is there language on the ballot?
John Weisskell, why don't you, or actually, Kathy, you're from Arizona. Why don't you, do you want to tackle that, or should we give it to John?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? Sorry about that.
Sure. There's a large difference between the Nevada and Arizona proposition, success or lack thereof in Arizona. Is the language on the ballot?
This is the RPS target, 50% by 2030. John, maybe you're closer to it.
I'm almost sure. I mean, it was Nevada ballot 6. It was raise the RPS. It's 25% today. Raise it 50% by 2030. In Arizona, which is a current 15% by 2025, raise it to 50% by 2030. Now, if I can maybe get to that question, certainly going from 15 to 50 is a bigger lift than going from 25 to 50. And certainly in Nevada, you had our utility, NV Energy, saying, heck, we plan to be 46% by 2023 if the other question loses, so getting to 50 is not a big deal. In Arizona, you had Pinnacle West and Arizona Public Service actively opposing, and this was a 50 plus. I mean, more money was spent on this Arizona RPS initiative than any of the Senate races in the entire country, except for Florida and Texas. So that could well account for different results if I'm getting at what I think the question is about.
So the money matters more than wording.
I think two things. I wasn't intimately involved with that, but I think as I read about some of the differences, 2 points also included that the Arizona measure was amending the state constitution, and so some argued that made the targets too inflexible. I think the Nevada one changed their constitution as well, but it didn't go into effect after quite a number of more years. But the other, I think, language that was included on the Arizona ballot measure specified that renewables would be pursued, quote, irrespective of cost to consumers, which I think, could have contributed to concern over the amendment the way it was drafted.
Okay, Laura, we have time for 2 more, maybe 3. What's next?
Okay, there's a question about infrastructure bills. So underneath the infrastructure bill umbrella, could ARPA-E, DOE loan program, and some USDA programs be positioned as infrastructure programs already in place?
Anybody?
I would say yes. Certainly, I mean, the beauty of an infrastructure bill is you can position almost anything under an infrastructure bill. I certainly when you can look for examples of what House Democrats think of infrastructure when they released their draft bill. I think it was called the Lift America Act back about a year ago when the Trump administration was starting to preview what an infrastructure package would look like, and I know they had billions in line at DOE. Some of that may fall under ARPA-E, and some of that certainly could fall under the loan program.
Okay. Laura, maybe switch to the end rather than the ones at the start. Just what's next?
Okay, there's a question. One of the items that continue to show up as an issue is high-speed community-related broadband, as well as net neutrality in this space. Any discussion about this as we perhaps look into some type of future infrastructure program?
Any views on this panel? It's more of an energy-focused group. Kathy, or Laura, how about another one?
Okay. Bear with me for just a second, finding the right questions. So going back to nuclear energy a little bit. Nuclear energy has garnered strong bipartisan support the last 3 years. Republicans for national security, Democrats for emission savings. Where does the Nuclear Energy Leadership Act go in 2019?
Any views?
Tom Hassenboehler again. I mean, I do think you've got some openings for nuclear, but it's tricky. I mean, I think calling out any one energy source is gonna, you've got members who have wanted to help fix the nuclear waste issue. That's gonna, continue to go around on small modular reactors and next generation nuclear support, streamlining that bill. I think certainly we'll see an audience in 2019 again. However, I don't think it's going to go as a standalone. It would have to figure out a way to hitch a ride on something larger like infrastructure.
So last question, Laura.
Last question. Any chance MLPs would be open to renewables?
Joe Mikrut, why don't you tackle that?
Yeah, Senator Coons has had a bill on this for quite a while, and I think if we do get into a position where we talked about all those things before regarding transferability or storage credits or EV credits, I think MLPs will be part of that. You know, one of the issues there is an MLP makes it difficult to pass through the tax benefits because of the passive loss rules. Whether you can adjust for that or not, or whether you can use MLPs for those projects that have already, whose credits have already expired, past their window, I think you'd have to show me the business model for that.
You know, one other comment on MLPs, the oil and gas sector, which has the ability to use them, has been moving away from them lately. John Gimigliano, last word on MLPs.
Yeah, I think it's just that question of, you know, what is the utility of an MLP? You know, we sort of flirted with, or the market flirted with yieldcos as an alternative at one point. You know, but I think the point that was made, which is we're now really getting past that first generation of projects that have now burned off their, you know, their tax attributes. And I think it is an interesting opportunity to look at things like MLPs or other structures that are not as tax motivated as historically the market has been. And so I think there's never been real political opposition to the MLP thing. I don't think it's been more of a question of how what its actual utility is.
Okay. Well, we've come to the end of an hour. We will post a recording of this on the Norton Rose Fulbright website later in the day. I'd like to thank our panelists, John Gimigliano with KPMG, Tom Hassenboehler with Coefficient Group, Joe Mikrut with Capital Tax Partners, John Weiskull with Berkshire Hathaway Energy, and Kathy Weiss with First Solar. I'm Keith Martin with Norton Rose Fulbright in Washington. Thank you, all of you, for patching in today. So long.
Thank you very much, panel, for your time and your excellent discussion.